Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining. So this week, we're going to talk about some things that are a bit challenging, and it's going to be something where I think, really have to reckon with what our role in the world is and what it is that we can do about what's going on. So with the shootings in Uvalde in the last week, this talk is not here to propose the solution to a problem. It's not here to fix everything, and it's not something where I'm arrogant enough to think that I have the solutions that are going to fix this once and for all. Really, the point of this conversation today is to really examine some of the underlying philosophical issues that are surrounding whether it's school shootings, gun rights, safety, and what we want our society to do. One of the things I really don't want to do today is talk too much about the shooting itself. I wasn't there, you probably weren't there. And we could speculate for years on what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and bicker and complain about what we think went wrong and how we think it could have gone better. But instead, we've got to process our emotions. We've got to acknowledge that we have them. It's a terrible thing. It's very upsetting, particularly for those of us who have kids or who care about children. And we can't let it fade, though. Once we get over that initial emotion, we can't let that be the only thing that would spur us to action and we forget and we move on. So let's process that emotion, and then really let's try and put the situation into a context that we can understand, that we can think about what are we going to do from this point, and really understand the ideas of life, what it means to balance risks with privileges and rights, and what about human development, and then discuss how we move together as a community and a country. So children have been murdered by someone who is clearly lost. What does it mean? So each of us is capable of assigning meaning to this, right? It's not only meaningful to the people who lost children, to the community. This means something to all of us. It's why we see people talking about it. So we get to choose what this means, both for each of us individually and for the community at large. And that's true of any event, whether good or bad. We can choose what it means by what we do with it. So how are you going to make this tragedy meaningful? Are you going to talk to your kids and your family? Are you going to talk to your elected officials? Are you going to change your own behavior? Even if it's something as simple as just remembering to be grateful for what you have and the family or the situations that you have at home. Are you going to make a change in the world? And if you're going to do that, are you going to choose to understand it first? That's a really challenging thing. So I wanted to start with that framing to say, a thing has happened and we get to choose what it means, but it requires us to stop for a second, to pause, to understand, and then really move forward. So I want to talk a little bit about how I see the problems. So one is with the shooters, right? People can blame individuals for bad actions, and this happens a lot. There's a lot of, oh, well, that was a bad apple. That was just a bad person. There's nothing really we could really do to stop that. And I think that's something we could question. One of the things, and honestly, one of the reasons I founded the church in the first place was because I see society fracturing, not just political, right? And this is years ago now. But in social ways, we're not as connected as we used to be for a variety of reasons we won't get into today, but we can discuss further afterward. And we see that these lost people fall into cracks. Maybe they don't have an organization. Maybe they were bullied. Maybe they don't feel a sense of connection. Maybe they have a false sense of connection from what they have seen or experienced on the internet. It's easy to find people who seem to be like you and who echo what you feel and what you think without forcing you to be critical about it. Those lost tend to be men. Looking at a piece of information that I found on NPR, the people who tend to commit these shootings are men who are 18 to 21 years old. That's interesting. There might be something we can do about that. There's also the expectations of manhood, of being macho, a sense of violence or unfeeling. Many of these males could lack positive male role models. I know that's something that I struggled with growing up, and choosing who I would be And I was very fortunate that I had enough of those male role models to help shape me. And then, of course, mental health is still stigmatized. It's not something that we seek treatment for like we would a broken arm or a broken leg. And of course, again, those online echo chambers really have the opportunity to reinforce hate. And they don't give alternative perspectives. There's nothing wrong with online communities. Online communities are an extraordinarily valuable way to find people who are like you, to build positive community together. But they also have the downside of it's really easy to find and be closed off from reality and to really fall down into what is very, very close to a cult. So how do we recover these lost souls, if you will? One of the big things that we do as humans is find a place of belonging. Humans have evolved to live in tribes, to live in communities, small villages. That's how we grew up, if you will. So we have to help people find their place. So again, the church is a way, right? And historically, that's where a lot of people congregated, literally and figuratively, is around the church. And while there are ups and downs to different churches and religions out there, or community groups, or whatever it happens to be, there's at least that sense of belonging. And there are rule sets. There are things where there are expectations, there are responsibilities, there are guidelines, right? And that there's public pressure for you to behave a certain way. And generally those ways are ways that support the broader community. So how do we do that today? Now, I do want to acknowledge that some groups are exclusive, they create division and enforce conformity, sometimes in ways that aren't the best. And today, I would say there are a lot of groups out there that almost focus more on hate thy neighbor than love thy neighbor, which is an unfortunate thing. And I would say that in the face of that, and in the face of the fracturing political and social fabric, we are the ones responsible for creating community, you and me. We're the ones that actually have to reach out to people to shape that environment. We can't wait for, name your stand-in for being someone who should be responsible, politicians, clergy leaders, business leaders. It's up to us. And I would say we have that responsibility to be nosy, right? To ask people how they're doing, not once, not twice, but 3 times. No, how are things really going for you? Oh, they're fine. We got to get past that fine point. What would have happened if someone had asked this young man, this kid, if you were fine at some point? It's a great question. We don't know the answer. And we have to hold others accountable. And I think this especially starts with our children. And it starts not only with our children, but with the children of others. It's interesting, having lived now overseas now for the last couple of years, other people will call out your kids in other cultures. That's interesting. It's a little bit more community focused because they realize, and the saying is there, it takes a village. Right? It takes a village to raise a child. Parents are good. They're great for the kids. Are you ever enough? Or do you need other people? I'd say yes, especially with 2 kids of my own. They're a challenge. So how do we bring them up? Now I want to talk a little bit. So that's the problem of the shooters, social fabric, community mental health. Now I want to talk a little bit with policy, right? I want to talk about policy in a kind of a philosophical sense. One of the challenges, and this is something unfortunately I've seen in my life being overseas, is that we have a significant unfamiliarity with death in life, particularly in Western society. Very few people die. And that's especially true of children in the modern age. And this is historically unprecedented. Until the 1900s, an average of 46% of children died before they were 15. That's almost half. And 1 in 4 infants died in the first year. By 1950, global child mortality dropped to 27%, and infant mortality is 16%, again, by the time they hit 15 and 1 year, respectively. Today, the global rates are only 4.6% for children, and 2.9% for infants. And the mortality rate in the US is less than 1% for children making it to the age of 15. Now, why do I bring this up? This is not to be coarse and to dismiss the tragedy that's happened. but it is to make an observation that we don't have a good sense of what it means when children die. We don't have a framework for it because it happens so seldomly. And so when it does happen, and especially when it happens in such a visible way, it causes us great moral injury, even if it had nothing to do with us. Because we know that as adults and as parents, it's our responsibility to protect our children. And so when we see children not be protected, we just have no understanding of how it could possibly be that children have died in such a terrible way. But what does this mean for us? It means that when tragedies happen, we tend to react poorly, not inappropriately, right? It's inappropriate. It is absolutely appropriate to be outraged and upset when children die. But we tend to carry that through, that emotional load, into the offering of solutions, and we tend not to do it in a reasoned way. That's why I wanted to take the time for this talk and to slow it down, to not get into the specifics of what happened, but to cause us to really ask some fundamental questions that I'm not going to try and answer today, but I want to pose, because I think if we can answer these questions and we can do it in a way where we're really balancing the risks and rewards of a given policy, we might be able to move forward as a country and a community. All right, so when it comes to solutions, again, I offer the context to help us feel the emotion, understand it, understand why it is, and that it's valid, but then to help us move past that and to get us past the rhetoric and the slinging of terms and the assigning of blame. When designing policy solutions, we have to realize that law is a blunt instrument. And what it ultimately tries to do is balance interests. A really coarse way to put it is, how many children should be allowed to die for us to have easy access to guns? That seems very, very rough to say. But when you look at the policies we have today, that is the balance. Guns are relatively easy to access. Now, I'm not saying they cause directly children to die, right? And not even specifically in context of shootings. There's also accidental shootings, suicides, etc. But we have to realize that rights, responsibilities, and safety are all things that are on a balance. So let's set aside gun rights for a second, right? That tends to be a hot topic. Again, something that's emotional. What should the balance be between children being perfectly safe and adults and parents understanding that life isn't guaranteed? Right? On one hand, you have extreme helicopter parenting, where you watch what the kids do all the time in an effort to keep them safe. But realistically, and if you have children, you know this, you can't keep them safe. They could fall at any time and land the wrong way, and there's nothing you can do about it. But again, because of that unfamiliarity with the death of children, it's something that we cannot fathom how we would possibly get over that loss. And so sometimes we choose things that tend to force us into a direction that's more extreme. We could insulate our children, put them in a bubble, put them in what are, effectively prisons, things that are completely sanitary, safe, where they cannot hurt themselves or others. The next question is, does that benefit their development? One of the key features of human beings is the ability to take and mitigate risk. If you don't learn how to manage risk by encountering consequences growing up, then it's really likely that you're going to end up with a significantly unbalanced sense of what is tolerable when it comes to risk as you get older. And that could have some pretty serious psychological consequences. So to be a good parent, in the sense, this is just my perspective, in the sense that I'm developing a whole human, I've accepted the fact that my kids might die. Now, I'm not going to put them into any sort of extreme harm. I'm not going to let a fly helicopter at the age of 5 or anything like that. But I've sort of pre-processed the idea that my kids may not make it to 18 or whatever age. And in doing that, I have let go of some of the little pieces of worry and angst and helicopter parenting, and let myself realize that like they're going to get hurt. Life is going to hurt them. And that's their challenge. And I'm going to protect them by teaching them, helping them cope and deal. But I cannot keep them safe. There's a great quote from Finding Nemo: "I'll never let anything happen to you." And the other character, Dory, says, well, if you never let anything happen to him, then nothing's ever going to happen to him. And that's sort of the sense that I think we have to consider in the greater policy scheme. Again, this isn't to be flippant. It's to help us realize that that's the real challenge, is that we can't keep them safe from everything. And to do so puts us in an extreme position. Now, what we can do is we can debate specific policy proposals. We can do that after we get done with the talk today. But what I want to do is I want to lay out some other competing interests. So one is the whole idea of gun rights versus safety. So in 2020, so some of the stats recently, and I'll link these in the chat later, there were 13.6 gun deaths per 100,000 people in the United States. And this is the highest since the 1974 peak of 16.3 deaths per 100,000 people. It's interesting to note more than half of those are suicides. And then 79% of all murders committed are by gun. Those are just some stats to give us some baselines to help us understand where the balance is. And you can also look up where we fit in the world stats. We're not the highest, but we're pretty high, particularly in terms of industrialized nations. So here's a question, and there are 5 questions I have. The first is, which is more valuable to America? Easy access to buy guns, or making it more difficult to kill with a gun? And that includes the totality of suicides and murder. Again, there's no clear answer. It's impossible to make guns illegal. You could do it. You could pass a law. It wouldn't get them to be all off the street. You can't uninvent guns. Now, it would cut down on the availability. It would likely prevent some suicides and murders by making a gun unavailable, by slowing down the ability for someone to take a life. On the other hand, when it comes to easy access of guns, I can't really think of a lot of gun emergencies. I personally have owned a number of guns. I've owned AR-15s, pistols, shotguns, etc. I can't ever say I've ever had a gun emergency where I needed a gun and I needed to buy a gun immediately. Some people would talk about the self-defense argument. There is some argument to that. I think it's pretty small. I know someone who worked in the police business for a long time, and he once told me I would never conceal carry because in an actual event where I have to respond with that, and if I'm not in uniform, no one knows if I'm the good guy or bad guy. So I'm much more likely to make the situation worse or get shot myself. That's an interesting perspective. I have personally concealed carried for the sake of self-defense. Never had to use it, thankfully. But that's something that I've considered a bit further lately. Is there really ever a reason to have a gun emergency? Is there a reason to need to buy a gun in a day or 3 days? In some countries, it's a month. Is there a reason not to do that? A wait period could help. There's a lot of studies that show that if people are forced to delay, some sort of action, they end up rethinking it. And that's particularly true with things like suicide and murder. So one of the caveats on that would be like self-defense for domestic abuse. And this is where the really difficult questions of policy come in. What would the differential be? How many lives would be lost to a domestic abuse situation versus how many would be saved by not having guns available? And that's something that could be studied, and gun laws or laws generally could be iterated on to adjust them. Question 2, what restrictions should there be on gun ownership? Licensing and training. It's easier to get a gun in some places than a driver's license. Both cars and guns are dangerous to the untrained. What licensing and training should be required? I know I've had a significant amount of training with weapons. I know how to use them. I would consider myself a responsible gun owner, and I think that should be a requirement. I don't think there's any issue with that whatsoever. Another question is insurance. We're required to maintain liability insurance for cars. What about guns? And then the other question would be, would it be just useful or discriminatory against the poor because it's more expensive? Would it become a thing that only a rich could afford? What about age? Insurance goes down at 25. And the reason for that is because your psychological development completes around that time. Your ability to assess and manage risk is fully formed by that point. When should you be allowed to buy a gun? Is it the right of a citizen at voting age? Is it the right before or after that point? Is there a reason why we should constrain it to a certain age? That's another question that could be answered under the idea of restrictions for gun ownership. Background checks has been one that's been frequently discussed. Mental health, criminal records, how would you integrate databases? Should private sellers be required to do it? Right? Commercial sellers are, even at gun shows now, right? That's one thing that's been done, but private sellers still aren't, at least not in certain places. The next point on that one is local, state, and national gun registry. Would it lead to a slippery slope of a police state, as some would argue? And would it matter with all the guns already out there? Or would it help with gun accountability and finding those who've committed crimes or who haven't secured their guns? What about the rules for drawing your weapon in self-defense, the no retreat, self-defense, and property protection laws? What should the balance be between those things and saving lives? There's, of course, the consideration also that criminals don't follow laws. Will implementing new or changing laws change the availability or the overall lethality of guns in America? All right, we're at question 3 now. Should we put guns in school for protection or not make them so they're not gun-free zones? Again, it becomes really complicated. As I was talking about my friend who had worked in law enforcement, it would dramatically ratchet up the tension in the situation and potentially lead to more lost life. An aggressor almost always has the first mover advantage. Is this something that would make a difference? Is it something where kids with their own mental health issues could get a hold of a weapon in the classroom and potentially use it? And then the question that's a follow-on to that is, what does that do to the learning environment? How does that change teacher behavior to where they're potentially looking at things through a threat-based lens versus a teaching lens? What does it also do to liability? That's a big question I think school districts would need to answer in terms of the ability to pay out if something happened. Question 4, how much should we focus on response versus prevention? Everything up to this point has been a balance between the two, but in the public discussion today, we see a lot about response. What should the police have done? What should people have done when they found out this other guy had some red flags? What should have been done, at the doors? What should the doors be like? But this is already a situation where we're assuming a kid or an angry person is going to get a hold of a gun and go attack a school. What's our responsibility as a community, as a society, to prevent these things? Response isn't going to stop people with the first mover advantage. Now, prevention is harder because it requires constant engagement and really difficult conversations. What's really amazing is that in life, it's much easier to have physical courage than moral courage. Physical courage means that we put ourselves in the way of danger, right? And that's seen as heroic and valuable. Moral courage means stepping out of line of social convention, right? Getting into people's business, being nosy, asking people difficult questions, discussing uncomfortable topics, things we tend not to do, especially in America. Now, we can't stop all bullying, but what programs could we implement to help people maybe just resolve conflict? How do we make people feel part of the tribe, the community, the group? And especially do that when our politics promotes exclusion and division. Question 5. This is where we get into legal versus ethical. All right, just because something's legal doesn't make it ethical or right. We know that from slavery and a variety of other laws that we had in the books. They were laws, they were legal. They weren't right, they weren't ethical. So what should our gun rights be? What should gun availability be versus the privilege of safety to an extent? We can always change laws. It's possible to change the Constitution, though hard. And we can do that to form a more perfect union if we need to. But we also need to consider the unintended consequences in both directions. So how will we answer these questions? And what we and how we answer them really boils down to two key factors in my view. Are we just responding to control our fear, or are we actually trying to make a real change? The cry to do something is very strong and justified, but we shouldn't rush to failure. We have to sustain this righteous outrage and the call over time to find true solutions. Right now, the Senate's given themselves 10 days to come up with something. Maybe it'll be good. History tends to show that laws tend to be a one and done attempt at solving a problem. Why do we have this perspective? Why do we not have an iterative approach like everything else in the world, right? If at first you don't succeed, try again. We're never done with something. We have to keep going. If we don't fix it the first time, we try again. We also have to realize that fix, in this sense, and really with everything, is about balance, not about 100% solution. We have to answer the difficult policy questions when it comes to political feasibility, rights, freedoms, privileges, culture, and balancing those things against safety and real human lives. Right? When you look at the pandemic that's going on right now, as a society, we've decided that a certain amount of people will die because we would rather have an open, functioning economy. Like, that's a policy decision and also a cultural decision. No one person sat down and said, we will allow 1 million people to die so that we can live this way. But together, we have decided that. And that's not right or wrong, right? That's how ethics works. We gather all of our individual morality together, have a debate on it, whether, deliberate or not, and we make choices. That's what we're doing with the same policy that we're discussing today. Some people will die because of actions that we take. There's no getting away from that. Some of those people will be children. The question is, what are we willing to accept? And the hard point here is that the answer is not zero. If anyone out there says that the answer is, the goal is 0 children will die, I don't think they fully realize what that means. Right? That means a fully locked down society where we guarantee people safety until they are 18. I don't think we're willing to do that. So we have to realize that there is some level of loss and risk and suffering so that society can continue along whatever we culturally value. So to put it bluntly, how many lives, some children, are worth the freedoms and privileges we have? We have to pick that gruesome number and realize that the freedoms aren't free. I think the shooting this last week has shown us that. It's put it right front and center in our minds. And I think the instinct of many of us is to shy away because it's a terrible thing to consider. This is the challenge of governance, of living in a modern society, of living in groups of more than a tribe. If we are going to make it in this world, and if humanity is going to survive, and human society is going to continue to function, these are the difficult conversations that we have to have. They're the problems we have to solve. And we can't do it by shying away from these challenges. The last piece that I'll leave you with is that death makes time valuable. These children and adults died in this event, but they lived too. What does their story mean to us? Will they fade into obscurity, or will they become a reason for change? We have to give value to what they are. If we all live forever, nothing would be valuable. So we get to choose, starting from today, what it is they died for. So it's up to you, it's up to me, and it's up to the community. Thank you everyone today for joining in. I really appreciate it. I hope that you will join the conversation, whether after the recording today or sometime in the future. We need to have these conversations, and it's not something we're going to resolve in the next month. So let's keep after it. Let's make the world a better place, and let's be human. Thank you.